Of course, Ender said contemptuously. I'm not as close to the floor as you are. More laughter, Bean flushed with anger. It's plain we can't count on old ways of doing things, Ender said, so you'd better plan on battles any time, and often. I can't pretend I like the way they're screwing around with us, but I do like one thing, that I've got an army that can handle it. After that, if he had asked them to follow him to the moon without spacesuits, they would have done it. Petra was not Karn Karbi. She had more flexible patterns and responded much more quickly to Ender's darting, improvised, unpredictable attack. As a result, Ender had 3 boys flashed and 9 disabled at the end of the battle. Petra was not gracious about bowing over his hand at the end either. The anger in her eyes seemed to say, I was your friend and you humiliate me like this? Ender pretended not to notice her fury. He figured that after a few more battles, she'd realize that in fact she had scored more hits against him than he expected anyone ever would again. And he was still learning from her. In practice today, he would teach his toon leaders how to counter the tricks Petra had played on them. Soon, they would be friends again. He hoped. At the end of the week, Dragon Army had fought 7 battles in 7 days. The score stood 7 wins and 0 losses. Ender had never had more losses than in the battle with Phoenix Army, and in 2 battles he had suffered not one soldier frozen or disabled. No one believed anymore that it was a fluke that put him in the first in standings. He had beaten top armies by unheard of margins. It was no longer possible for the other commanders to ignore him. A few of them sat with him at every meal, carefully trying to learn from him how he had defeated his most recent opponents. He told them freely, confident that few of them would know how to train their soldiers and their toon leaders to duplicate what his could do. And while Ender talked with a few commanders, much larger groups gathered around the opponents Ender had defeated, trying to find out how Ender might be beaten. There were many, too, who hated him for being young, for being excellent, for having made their victories look paltry and weak. Ender saw it first in their faces when he passed them in the corridors. Then he began to notice that some boys would get up in a group and move to another table if he sat near them in the commander's mess. And there began to be elbows that accidentally jostled him in the game room, feet that got entangled with his when he walked into and out of the gym, spittle and wads of wet paper that struck him from behind as he jogged through the corridors. They couldn't beat him in the battle room, and knew it. So instead, they would attack him where it was safe, where he was not a giant, but just a little boy. Ender despised them. But secretly, so secretly that he didn't even know it himself, he feared them. It was just such little torments that Peter had always used, and Ender was beginning to feel far too much at home. These annoyances were petty, though, and Ender persuaded himself to accept them as another form of praise. Already the other armies were beginning to imitate Ender. Now, most soldiers attacked with knees tucked under them. Formations were breaking up now, and more commanders were sending out toons to slip along the walls. None had caught on yet to Ender's 5-toon organization. It gave him the slight advantage that when they had accounted for the movements of 4 units, they wouldn't be looking for a 5th. Ender was teaching them all about null gravity tactics, but where could Ender go to learn new things? He began to use the video room, filled with propaganda vids about Mazer Rackham and other great commanders of the forces of humanity in the first and second invasion. Ender stopped the general practice an hour early and allowed his toon leaders to conduct their own practice in his absence. Usually they staged skirmishes, toon against toon. Ender stayed long enough to see that things were going well, then left to watch the old battles. Most of the vids were a waste of time. Heroic music, close-ups of commanders and medal-winning soldiers, confused shots of Marines invading bugger installations. But here and there he found useful sequences. Ships like points of light, maneuvering in the dark of space, or better still, the lights on shipboard plotting screens, showing the whole of a battle. It was hard from the videos to see all 3 dimensions, and the scenes were often short and unexplained. But Ender began to see how well the buggers used seemingly random flight paths to create confusion, how they used decoys and false retreats to draw the IF ships into traps. Some battles had been cut into many scenes, which were scattered through the various videos. By watching them in sequence, Ender was able to reconstruct whole battles. He began to see things that the official commentators never mentioned. They were always trying to arouse pride in human accomplishments and loathing of the buggers. but Ender began to wonder why humanity had won at all. Human ships were sluggish. Fleets responded to new circumstances unbearably slow, while the bugger fleet seemed to act in perfect unity, responding to each challenge instantly. Of course, in the first invasion, the human ships were completely unsuited to fast combat, but then so were the bugger ships. It was only in the second invasion that the ships and weapons were swift and deadly. So it was from the buggers, not the humans, that Ender learned strategy. He felt ashamed and afraid of learning from them, since they were the most terrible enemy, ugly and murderous and loathsome. But they were also very good at what they did. To a point. They always seemed to follow one basic strategy only: gather the greatest number of ships at the key point of conflict. They never did anything surprising, anything that seemed to show either brilliance or stupidity in a subordinate officer. Discipline was apparently very tight. And there was one oddity. There was plenty of talk about Mazer Rackham, but precious little video of his actual battle. Some scenes from early in the battle, Rackham's tiny force looked pathetic against the vast power of the main bugger fleet. The buggers had already beaten the main human fleet out in the Comet Shield, wiping out the earliest starships and making a mockery of human attempts at high strategy. That film was often shown to arouse again and again the agony and terror of bugger victory. Then, the fleet coming to Mazer Rackham's little force near Saturn, the hopeless odds. And then one shot from Mazer Rackham's little cruiser, one enemy ship blowing up. That's all that was ever shown. Lots of films showing Marines carving their way into bugger ships, lots of bugger corpses lying around inside, but no film of buggers killing in personal combat unless it was spliced in from the first invasion. It frustrated Ender that Mazer Rackham's victory was so obviously censored. Students in the battle school had much to learn from Mazer Rackham, and everything about his victory was concealed from view. The passion for secrecy was not very helpful to the children who had to learn to accomplish again what Mazer Rackham had done. Of course, as soon as word got around that Ender Wiggin was watching the war vids over and over again, the video room began to draw a crowd. Almost all were commanders watching the same vids Ender watched, pretending they understood why he was watching and what he was getting out of it. Ender never explained anything. Even when he showed 7 scenes from the same battle but from different vids, only one boy asked, tentatively, "Are some of those from the same battle?" Ender only shrugged, as if it didn't matter. It was during the last hour of practice, on the 7th day, only a few hours after Ender's army had won its 7th battle, that Major Anderson himself came into the video room. He handed a slip of paper to one of the commanders sitting there and then spoke to Ender. "Colonel Graff wishes to see you in his office immediately." Ender got up and followed Anderson through the corridors. Anderson palmed the locks that kept students out of the officers' quarters. Finally, they came to where Graff had taken root on a swivel chair, bolted to the steel floor. His belly spilled over both armrests now, even when he sat upright. Ender tried to remember. Graff hadn't seemed particularly fat at all when Ender first met him only 4 years ago. Time and tension were not being kind to the administrator of the battle school. 7 days since your first battle, Ender," said Graff. Ender did not reply. "And you've won 7 battles, once a day." Ender nodded. "Your scores are unusually high, too." Ender blinked. "To what, Commander, do you attribute your remarkable success?" "You gave me an army that does whatever I can think for it to do." "And what have you thought for it to do?" "We orient downward toward the enemy gate and use our lower legs as a shield. We avoid formations and keep our mobility. It helps that I've got 5 tunes of 8 instead of 4 of 10. Also, our enemies haven't the time to respond effectively to our new techniques, so we keep beating them with the same tricks. That won't hold up for long." "So you don't expect to keep winning?" "Not with the same tricks." Graff nodded. "Sit down, Ender." Ender and Anderson both sat. Graff looked at Anderson, and Anderson spoke next. "What condition is your army in, fighting so often?" "They're all veterans now." "But how are they doing? Are they tired?" "If they are, they won't admit it." "Are they still alert?" "You're the ones with the computer games that play with people's minds. You tell me." "We know what we know. We want to know what you know." "These are very good soldiers, Major Anderson. I'm sure they have limits, but we haven't reached them yet. Some of the newer ones are having trouble because they never really mastered some basic techniques, but they're working hard and improving. What do you want me to say? That they need to rest? Of course they need to rest. They need a couple of weeks off. Their studies are shot to hell. None of us are doing any good in our classes, but you know that, and apparently you don't care. So why should I? Graf and Anderson exchanged glances. Ender, why are you studying the videos of the Bugger Wars? Those videos were created for propaganda purposes. All our strategies have been edited out. I know. Graf and Anderson exchanged glances again. Graf drummed on his table. You don't play the fantasy game anymore, he said. Ender didn't answer. Tell me why you don't play it. Because I won. You never win everything in that game. There's always more. I won. Ender, we want to help you be as happy as possible, but if you want to make me the best soldier possible, go down and look at the standings. Look at the all-time standings. So far, you're doing an excellent job with me. Congratulations. Now, when are you going to put me up against an army? Graf's set lips turned to a smile, and he shook a little with silent laughter. Anderson handed Ender a slip of paper. Now, he said, Bonso Madrid, Salamander Army, 1200. That's 10 minutes from now, said Ender. My army will be in the middle of showering up after practice. Graf smiled. Better hurry then, boy. He got to his army's barracks 5 minutes later. Most were dressing after their showers. Some had already gone to the game room or the video room to wait for lunch. He sent 3 younger boys to call everyone in and made everyone else dress for battle as quickly as they could. This one's hot and there's no time, Ender said. They gave Bonso notice about 20 minutes ago, and by the time we get to the door, they'll have been inside for a good 5 minutes at least. The boys were outraged, complaining loudly in the slang that they usually avoided around the commander. What they doing to us? They be crazy, nay? Forget why. We'll worry about that tonight. Are you tired? Fine, Molo answered. We worked our butts off in practice today, not to mention beating the crap out of Ferret this morning. Same day nobody ever do 2 battles, said Crazy Tom. Ender answered in the same tone. Nobody ever beat Dragon Army either. This be your big chance to lose? Ender's taunting question was the answer to their complaints. Win first. Ask questions later. All of them were back in the room and most of them were dressed. Move! Shouted Ender, and they ran along behind him, some of them still dressing when they reached the corridor outside the battle room. Many of them were panting, a bad sign. They were too tired for this battle. The door was already open. There were no stars at all, just empty space in a dazzlingly bright room. Nowhere to hide, not even in darkness. My heart, said Crazy Tom. They haven't come out yet either. Ender put his hand across his own mouth to tell them to be silent. With the door open, of course, the enemy could hear every word they said. Ender pointed all around the door to tell them that Salamander Army was undoubtedly deployed against the wall all around the door, where they wouldn't be seen, but could easily flash anyone who came out. Ender motioned for them all to back away from the door. Then he pulled forward a few of the taller boys, including Crazy Tom, and made them kneel, not squatting back to sit on their heels, but fully upright. So they formed an L with their bodies. He flashed them. In silence, the army watched him. He selected the smallest boy, Bean, handed him Tom's gun, and made Bean kneel in Tom's frozen legs. Then he pulled Bean's hands, each holding a gun, through Tom's armpits. Now the boys understood. Tom was a shield, an armored spacecraft, and Bean was hiding inside. He was certainly not invulnerable, but he would have time. Ender assigned 2 more boys to throw Tom and Bean through the door, but signaled them to wait. He went on through the army, quickly assigning groups of 4, a shield, a shooter, and 2 throwers. Then when all were frozen or armed or ready to throw, he signaled the throwers to pick up their burdens, throw them through the door, and then jump through themselves. Move! Shouted Ender. They moved. 2 at a time, the shield pairs went through the door, backwards so that the shield would be between the shooter and the enemy. The enemy opened fire at once, but they mostly hit the frozen boy in front. In the meantime, with 2 guns to work with and their targets neatly lined up and spread flat along the wall, the dragons had an easy time of it. It was almost impossible to miss. And as the throwers also jumped through the door, they got handholds on the same wall with the enemy, shooting at a deadly angle so that the salamanders couldn't figure out whether to shoot at the shield pairs, slaughtering them from above, or the throwers shooting at them from their own level. By the time Ender himself came through the door, the battle was over. It hadn't taken a full minute from the time the first dragon passed through the door until the shooting stopped. Dragon had lost 20 frozen or disabled, and only 12 boys were undamaged. It was their worst score yet, but they had won. When Major Anderson came out and gave Ender the hook, Ender could not contain his anger. I thought you were going to put us up against an army that could match us in a fair fight. Congratulations on the victory, Commander. Bean! Shouted Ender. If you had commanded Salamander Army, what would you have done? Bean, disabled but not completely frozen, called out from where he drifted near the enemy door. Keep a shifting pattern of movement going in front of the door. You never hold still when the enemy knows exactly where you are. As long as you're cheating, Ender said to Anderson. Why don't you train the other enemy to cheat intelligently? I suggest that you remobilize your army, said Anderson. Ender pressed the buttons to thaw both armies at once. Dragon Army dismissed, he shouted immediately. There would be no elaborate formation to accept the surrender of the other army. This had not been a fair fight, even though they had won. The teachers had meant them to lose, and it was only Bonzo's ineptitude that had saved them. There was no glory in that. Only as Ender himself was leaving the battle room did he realize that Bonzo would not realize that Ender was angry at the teachers. Spanish honor. Bonzo would only know that he had been defeated even when the odds were stacked in his favor, that Ender had had the youngest child in his army publicly state that Bonzo should have done to win, and that Ender had not even stayed to receive Bonzo's dignified surrender. If Bonzo had not already hated Ender, he would surely have begun, and hating him as he did, this would surely turn his rage murderous. Bonzo was the last person to strike me, thought Ender. I'm sure he has not forgotten that. Nor had he forgotten the bloody affair in the battle room, when the older boys tried to break up Ender's practice session. Nor had many others. They were hungry for blood then. Bonzo will be thirsty for it now. Ender toyed with the idea of taking advanced personal defense, but with battles now possible not only every day, but twice in the same day, Ender knew he could not spare the time. I'll have to take my chances. The teachers got me into this. They can keep me safe. Bean flopped down on his bunk in utter exhaustion. Half the boys in the barracks had already fallen asleep, and it was still 15 minutes before lights out. Wearily, he pulled his desk from its locker and signed on. There was a test tomorrow in geometry, and Bean was woefully unprepared. He could always reason things out if he had enough time, and he had Euclid when he was 5. But the test had a time limit, so there wouldn't be a chance to think. He had to know, and he didn't know, and he would probably do badly on the test. But they had won twice today, and so he felt good. As soon as he signed on, however, all thoughts of geometry were banished. A message paraded around the desk. See me at once, Ender. The time was 21:50, only 10 minutes before lights out. How long ago had Ender sent it? Still, he'd better not ignore it. There might be another battle in the morning. The thought made him weary, and whatever Ender wanted to talk to him about, there wouldn't be time then. So Bean rolled off the bunk and walked emptily through the corridor to Ender's room. He knocked. Come in, said Ender. Just saw your message. Fine, said Ender. It's near lights out. I'll help you find your way in the dark. I just didn't know if you knew what time it was. I always know what time it is. Bean sighed inwardly. It never failed. Whenever he had any conversation with Ender, it turned into an argument. Bean hated it. He recognized Ender's genius and honored him for it. Why couldn't Ender ever see anything good in him? Remember 4 weeks ago, Bean, when you told me to make you a toon leader? I've made 5 toon leaders, and 5 assistants since then, and none of them was you. Ender raised his eyebrows. Was I right? Yes, sir. So tell me how you've done in these 8 battles. Today was the first time they disabled me, but the computer listed me as getting 11 hits before I had to stop. I've never had less than 5 hits in a battle. I've also completed every assignment I've been given. Why did they make you a soldier so young, Bean? No younger than you were. But why? I don't know. Yes, you do, and so do I. I've tried to guess, but they're just guesses. You're very good. They knew that. They pushed you ahead. Tell me why, Bean. Because they need us, that's why. Bean sat down on the floor and stared at Ender's feet. Because they need somebody to beat the buggers. That's the only thing they care about. It's important that you know that, Bean, because most boys in this school think the game is important for itself. But it isn't. It's only important because it helps them find kids who might grow up to be real commanders in the real war. But as for the game, screw that. That's what they're doing, screwing up the game. Funny, I thought they were just doing it to us. A game 9 weeks earlier than it should have come. A game every day, and now 2 games in the same day. Bean, I don't know what the teachers are doing, but my army is getting tired, and I'm getting tired, and they don't care at all about the rules of the game. I've pulled the old charts up from the computer. No one has ever destroyed so many enemies and kept so many of his own soldiers whole in the history of the game. You're the best, Ender. Ender shook his head, maybe, but it was no accident that I got the soldiers I got. Launchies, rejects from other armies. But put them together, and my worst soldier could be a tune leader in another army. They've loaded things my way, but now they're loading it all against me. Bean, they want to break us down. They can't break you. You'd be surprised. Ender breathed sharply, suddenly, as if there were a stab of pain, or he had to catch a sudden breath in a wind. Bean looked at him and realized that the impossible was happening. Far from baiting him, Ender was actually confiding in him. Not much, but a little. Ender was human, and Bean had been allowed to see. Maybe you'll be surprised, said Bean. There's a limit to how many clever new ideas I can come up with every day. Somebody's going to come up with something to throw at me that I haven't thought of before. I won't be ready. What's the worst that could happen? You lose 1 game. Yes, that's the worst that could happen. I can't lose any games, because if I lose any... He didn't explain himself, and Bean didn't ask. I need you to be clever, Bean. I need you to think of solutions to problems we haven't seen yet. I want you to try things that no one has ever tried because they're absolutely stupid. Why me? Because even though there are some better soldiers than you in Dragon Army, not many, but some, there's nobody who can think better and faster than you. Bean said nothing. They both knew it was true. Ender showed him his desk. On it were 12 names, 2 or 3 from each tune. Choose 5 of these, said Ender. 1 from each tune. They're a special squad, and you'll train them. Only during the extra practice sessions. Talk to me about what you're training them to do. Don't spend too long on any one thing. Most of the time, you and your squad will be part of the whole army, part of your regular tunes. But when I need you, when there's something to be done that only you can do. These are all new, said Bean. No veterans. Last week, Bean, all our soldiers were veterans. Don't you realize that on the individual soldier standings, all 40 of our soldiers are in the top 50? That you have to go down 17 places to find a soldier who isn't a dragon? What if I can't think of anything? Then I was wrong about you. Bean grinned. You weren't wrong. The lights went out. Can you find your way back, Bean? Probably not. Then stay here. If you listen very carefully, you can hear the good fairy come in the night and leave our assignment for tomorrow. They won't give us another battle tomorrow, will they? Ender didn't answer. Bean heard him climb into bed. He got up from the floor and did likewise. He thought of a half-dozen ideas before he went to sleep. Ender would be pleased. Every one of them was stupid.